Hey guys, quantum leadership. What is it? A new style of leadership and a new philosophy. Now, continuing our lessons in leadership series with Cree, for today's video, I've invited a very special guest and he'll be talking concepts of quantum leadership with us. Stay tuned, this is going to be hugely interesting.
But it involves a high degree of self-actualization and realization before you're able to recognize the different aspects of the being in terms of the being and the ego, and realizing that they're actually separate, although they're housed within the same vessel.
One of the things, Ted, I can just add what he's saying. One of the things that helped me in that is coming back to my first point around quantum thinking. And the reason why people can't identify ego in themselves is because they don't believe they have one. They don't believe there's a subconscious thing that's going to change and make the. They don't believe it. Seriously, and if you believe that, you won't see it.
Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's video, part 3 in our Lessons in Leadership series. Now I'm with Cree Govender, but tonight we have a very special guest. I want to introduce you to Paul Morley, IT exec at Nedbank. Paul, thank you for joining us tonight. Warm welcome and hope you are doing well.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Cree. I'm glad to be here. I hope we can have a nice good chat around leadership in the modern era. Looking forward to this meeting for all week.
Looking forward to hearing your views on leadership, Paul. Cree, how are you doing? You're doing well, and you're all geared up for part 3.
Yeah, fantastic. Really excited to have Paul here. I'm very keen to hear about his views on leadership, and thank you, Dev, for setting it up.
Okay, so we're going to do something new and cutting edge for the viewer, you, tonight. And that's why we have Paul here, right? Now, there's a new concept in the school of leadership called quantum leadership. Now, it's quite funny. When Paul actually first told me about this, I thought he was pulling my leg. Evidently, he isn't. There is actually a big school of thought around quantum leadership, and it stems from what we're seeing in quantum physics, where quantum physics is inherently unpredictable compared to classical Newtonian physics. So with that, I want to go first to Paul and ask him, for those, and there's many of them out there who haven't heard of quantum leadership, in a nutshell, how would you describe this new emerging school of thought?
Yes, so the base philosophies are around very similar characteristics of quantum physics and quantum science, which you've just mentioned. But what really grabbed my attention, and the purest definition of quantum thinking that I found, that resonated with me a few years ago after an argument about leadership, by the way. I had a serious argument around leadership and data science, funny enough. And through that process, I found something that really resonated with me, and it's a little saying by the guy who put this down on paper. It was quantum thinking is the ability to hold two opposing thoughts in your mind at the same time and not be persuaded by either one. So I thought about that. I went, wow, that's interesting. Then I thought about, then I looked at, well, okay, that's interesting. It's a good philosophical question, but how would that actually work in the real world? And then I went a little bit further, dug in a little bit deeper, and there's a couple of things that we all know about, and it's these paradoxical thoughts and this paradoxical thinking and Newtonian thinking. So the classic leadership is based on Newtonian leadership or Newtonian thinking. More of the classical point, and that is a point of hierarchy. Newton, when he decided his laws, pretty much fundamentally changed the world as we know it. And through that process, coming through the first industrial age, the Newtonian leadership, Newtonian thought was a model of hierarchy. Guy at the top, CEO, leaders, execs, all the way down the bottom, and it's sort of not really democratic in nature. But and then up paradoxes, caused paradoxes. Now, where this was where this resonated for me, and I was talking in a debate around this thing, and then it hit me. Let's imagine, why is this important in the modern leadership style? Well, imagine this example. I'll give you an example here. Imagine Brent Swanepoel, our CEO at Nedbank. who leads the IT divisions within Nedbank, and let's say the executive head for retail banking. Okay. Now we're going into this post-COVID period. Now imagine this scenario, and I think this will resonate with everybody. You've got, on the one hand, you've got Fred forward-thinking sort of leadership style technologist, and he wants to modernize the bank, to prepare the bank for the future so it's in a modern position. It can compete in a modern society in the future, et cetera, which is the right thing to do. If you're a CIO, you must protect the bank. You're the guy that everybody relies on for technological direction. And then you've got the business in these tough times. And so Fred goes to the board and he says, I want 2 billion rand, as an example, to go and do this modernization. I want to go and do these projects. What was it, 2 billion rand? It's a lot of money. And then you've got the head of retail. He's under pressure around profits and the downturn. And what's his job? His job is to save money, run down of operations. So you have these two opposing forces. You've got Freddie wants money to prepare the bank for the future universe and the future society. But then you've got the guy on the side here, he owns the business, he owns the profit and loss sheet. And he's saying, no, but we've got time, we need to drive the cost down. Now and those are diametrically opposed. And they always land up in an argument. Now imagine for 1 minute, if using quantum thinking as an example, imagine for instance that you step away and you say, actually, and you think about this, actually both those individuals are absolutely correct in their own context. So Fred's not wrong and he's not right, neither is the head of retail, wrong or right. They're both right in their context, but it's still a paradox because the stuff doesn't fit. And that's the basic notion behind quantum thinking is quantum physics. That's what happens in quantum physics, but it doesn't make sense. So when you transpose that to quantum thinking, that's the example. Now, maybe the other thing that we're coming on the back of that, then you said, okay, so quantum physics says around the laws of mathematics. Quantum physics says all the answers exist at the same time. That's the basic premise or the basic layman's interpretation. All the answers exist at the same time. So basically, I know all the answers, but are you asking the right question? So actually, in quantum physics, you're looking for the question. You're not looking for the answer. The answers all exist, all at the same time. That's the whole premise behind cats and Gibbs cats, in quantum physics. So if you look at it from a leadership perspective, and I look at these two opposing forces, you got your CIO driving evolution on technology to prepare the bank for the future, and you've got the profit and loss executives driving the costs down to survive. They're both right, but they're both opposing. Now, if you take a position, you say actually they're both right. You accept the fact that they're actually both. Let's not argue. Let's accept you're both right. So, what is the question I need to find that proves both answers correct? And you've got to go and find a question. You've got to find a statement that proves that both of them are right without them individually being right. They're both right at the same time. And that is the premise behind quantum thinking. It's got a lot to do with lateral thinking. So, and it works for me. And I'll give you another example I use, a very easy example. Try this in your own business. Walk into a boardroom and you're going to negotiate, you're going to have a fight. Say to everybody in the boardroom, you're all correct. So let's find out what the actual question is. It takes so much hostility out of that room. If you accept the other person's view, now he doesn't have to argue with you. He's not going to get all this emotional upset with you because you've accepted his view, but he needs to accept your view. So let's for a moment say, you're both right. So let's go and find the question to the problem where the problem is both of you are right. So what's the question? You'll be surprised how that changes the attitude and the emotions in the boardroom, changes the attitude of a team. And I do it with my own teams, and I've seen massive progress just by using that as simple match. It's not right. Let's just assume we're all right. Let's just out of the market. Here's my view. I accept your view. Right. Let's talk about what is the position we need to be in for both of us to be right without compromise. And that's the secret behind that. And it's a new style of leadership, and that drives and that resonates with me because if you follow that process in your thought, you'll be surprised what you get out of a team. You'll also be surprised how quickly you solve problems. Funny enough, it works very well in root cause analysis. So you accept everything is right. So now and it guides you to the position. So that's the premise behind it. It's really the ability to hold two opposing thoughts at the same time in one's mind without being biased. That's really what it is. And it takes practice.
So there's so much value in that opening salvo there. I actually made quite a few notes, right? Accepting, let's just recap for the viewers, right? Accepting that more than one answer is correct what's the correct question that we're trying to find. Look, I guess you have to be a leader to hold two opposing views in your head and not go crazy, right?
Well, yeah, I think that's the purpose of being a leader. I think those are the skills that we've lost, to be honest. Because that's what, that's exactly what you expect from a leader. That's exactly what
Yeah.
we expect from a leader.
So, Cree, I want to then throw that your way, and I know you are big on classical leadership, but I know you're currently doing some research on quantum leadership as well. This sounds very empowering to large teams potentially where there's conflict. What's your view, Cree?
So it's a new area, absolutely. But the day that you stop learning is the day that you'll absolutely cease to be a leader, right? There's I think it's a saying that I shared with you in one of the other segments that we had, and it's a often used one that says, leaders read and readers lead. And when it came up to this aspect of quantum leadership, that's the first thing that I dove into. Is trying to read and understand, and if you have that, we often speak in Microsoft about the growth mindset, and once you're open to those, new ideas and potentially even changing the leadership style that you've potentially adopted, that's a true hallmark of you being a forward-looking leader, and it's something that will hold you in good stead for the years to come. Paul mentioned it at the outset. He said that, the classical Newtonian style. I remember in my first job, my first leader was ex-military. So his leadership style was absolutely, regimented, very hierarchical, and it had its time and its place in terms of society at that point in time. But as we found, changes in the world occurring in society and greater acceptance, especially for people in terms of different aspects, right? Be it race, creed, religion, orientation, all of those things. So too did leadership need to adapt and evolve, and it will constantly do that, to be in line and in step with society. It has to be that way. If it's at odds with that, then you've lost a big part of that. But getting back to the core of the question in terms of this, what I found really interesting in terms of the quantum leadership aspect were the aspects that they now speak to in terms of certain domains speaking towards influence through spirituality, not religion, but spirituality, aspects touching on innovation, things that you wouldn't find in the classical
Yeah.
leadership guides of yesteryear. So very empowering from that perspective. But it all really does hang off one key aspect, and it's something that I'd like to chat to Paul about. The people need to be ready as well. They need to be at a space where they've gone through some degree of enablement, and or maybe not really enablement, but when awareness has been created around this so that they're empowered. The way that people have been geared for the longest time, if we go back to Paul's example in terms of people entering a boardroom with diametrically opposed views, we've all been geared towards attaching towards a position and really digging your heels in terms of defending that position. And anything otherwise is seen as you conceding or potentially a sign of weakness. And this flies in the face of that, right? And it's quite radical from that perspective. And if anything, those are the skills that will be needed to survive in the new world. In this year that we've come out of with regards to COVID,
The
that's
unpredictable
taught us a lot.
world. Yeah, the unpredictable world. So just remember, viewers, I mean, the one thing that stuck with me, what Paul said was, all the answers exist. Make sure you're searching for the right question. I'm gonna come back to that, right? Now, the second part of quantum leadership has to do with how quantum physics is inherently unpredictable. I mean, we still, as a civilization, we're not on top of quantum physics, right? I interviewed a quantum physicist recently. Some of you would have seen it. I had a bit of a headache afterwards. I'm not going to lie to you. And but the interesting thing when it comes to leadership is that it talks about how quantum leadership, it basically prepares you for unpredictability. And man, that would have been awesome if you became a quantum organization in 2019, being ready for 2020. However, I want to throw this to the two of you, and I'll start with Paul. How do you plan for chaos? Is it even
You
possible?
don't. You don't plan scouts. And I asked a similar question to somebody said to me, Paul, and I think it was on one of some of our projects. They go, well, how do you prepare? How do you prepare your team for uncertainty going through this period? You don't. What you must do is give them the skills to deal with uncertainty. There's a big difference between the two. So what is it? What do I mean by that? So how do you prepare for uncertainty? Well, you give them the skills like quantum thinking. You give them the skills like lateral thinking. You give them the skills like an agile mind or a creative mind. You give them the skills that allows you to deal with uncertainty almost in real time and be fine with it. You don't give them hard and empathy and all those types of skills. The skills I'm talking about is you prepare them mentally for change, and unknown change. And that is one of the reasons why I sat over 2 years ago with my team and went through quantum thinking with them and told them, and I had a lengthy discussion with a number of these on my teams, is to prepare them for periods of uncertainty. Because you can prepare them to remove the fear. And you've heard me talk about fear and ego a number of times in various other conversations. Now, there are two things that destroy leaders, okay? And there are two things that influence leaders. And it doesn't matter what leadership style you use. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or one of those military type leaders. It doesn't really matter. There's two things that are the pitfall for all leaders. That is ego and fear. And a good leader must take a check on both of those. One, ego destroys leadership, and you'll see that in a lot of modern day leadership structures. Is leaders abuse their power and they force their way because of the ego. They want to be right. They want to go and they want their opinion. We talked about it earlier when you have these two opposing forces. Everybody wants their own thing. So ego is a big problem when it comes to leaders, and leaders must always check on that because people make decisions based on the ego. They make decisions because they're right, when they want to be right, and they are right. They want to prove a point. You see that all the time. The other thing is fear. Fear destroys leaders overnight, and that is if you cannot make the right calls and you cannot be calm and make a decision when it's needed because you're fearful of the repercussions or you feel fearful of a potential outcome, that destroys you. And that comes back to a very good point of mine that I use in data sciences, and a quote that I have, my own quote is, never ever base strategic decisions on statistical probabilities. I never base a decision on statistical probabilities. Now think about that for a moment. How many leaders make decisions based on statistical probabilities? Basically means if there's an 80-20 chance of something happen, yeah, I'll make the decision because there's an 80% chance it'll work, 20%, or vice versa. Like I don't want to make the call because there's a very high chance of failure. Like there's a 98% chance of this thing failing, so I'm not going to make the call. I'm not going to go down.
What do you use if we cannot bring stats into it?
Well, stats are a lie. It's an average set of averages. Yeah, let's be honest. That is as inaccurate as you can get. When you average and average, that's what stats is. It's an average game. On average, listen to economists on the radio. Have you ever heard of an economist? All things being equal, this is the outcome.
Ceteris paribus in Latin, as they say.
Yeah, come on. That's exactly what I'm talking about in those stats. So you need something more. You need something concrete that is not based on statistical representation of a problem. You can use it as an input, but you must never ever use that as a decision point. It can enhance a decision. It can you can use it as part of a decision-making process, but you can never base your decision. And that comes back to the fear aspect of things. So leaders must be very careful with those two. Ego and fear kill leaders overnight.
So I just want to make sure we're noting that, right? So you're saying, let's just go back to the first point. Very, very important. You do not plan for chaos, even with quantum leadership, right? What you do is you give your guys the skills necessary to deal with almost anything. Can I summarize that, Paul, by saying you then want to create a culture of thinkers, not robot workers? You want people to think on their feet.
Well, yes, that's part of it, but I wouldn't say that's the only dimension because thinking on your feet can also be seen as a bit of a cowboy. You know, you're not thinking about it; you're just making a call. You know, so yes, it is a dimension, but I think the essence of what you're trying to put is you need a group of people that are team oriented, that understand enough about their fear and ego to go through a period of uncertainty, because uncertainty breeds fear. And if you're a fearful leader and you're in uncertain times, your job is going to be tough.
Yeah.
Because uncertainty brings fear, and you've got to be able to recognize fear. You've got to be able to recognize and name your ego. You must keep it in check, and you must always be aware of it. If you can do those things, if you can check your ego and you check your fear all the time, doesn't matter who you are, even a personal, you don't have to be a leader for this. If you as an individual check your fear and understand your fear and understand your ego, you won't be scared of uncertainty because you can go through uncertainty smiling. And I think that's fundamental. And it goes down to the individual. It's not even a leadership skill, it's an individual skill. I mean, I'm not scared of uncertainty and change because I check my ego and fear every single day. I know at every point in the day, is my ego swaying me on this call? Is my call not being right because I'm fearful of something? Am I fearful? So I'm always checking my decision-making process against those two pillars, ego and fear. How much ego and how much fear is influencing my decision?
Yeah.
And if you do it consciously, you're aware of it. And that's what saves you.
So then that's a good point, Paul. And I think those emotional aspects, ego and fear, is something, Cree, you've done a lot of work in, a lot of research in addressing those. So leading on from what Paul said, how would you help people develop such that they get on top of both ego and fear? And I think ego and fear have led to some terrible decisions, perhaps even wars and other things, ills in our civilization. So, Cree, from the research you've done, how would you address those two?
And an interesting question. And before we get to that, you spoke about this aspect in terms of how do you deal with chaos, and can you plan for chaos? So I just want to touch on one aspect in terms of that before I get back to your question. And absolutely agree with Paul. You can never account for it or any, or you can account for probably a few sets of scenarios, but you can't plan for everything. And chaos, what you need to be able to do is empower your people absolutely to be able to stay calm, think, and make the best decisions in those moments. If I think back to the Navy SEALs as an example, that's how they're trained, right? They're trained for certain situations, and when they plan to go in, they map out various routes and potential scenarios. But things invariably go awry. They always do. And their ability to be as precise and as accurate as they are is driven from that. Being able to stay calm when there's chaos all around them, and being able to operate as a unit then that stays calm to make the best possible decisions. There's a book by Leif Babin and Jacko Willock called Extreme Ownership. And in terms of that, they speak to these aspects, right? So, and it ties on to your earlier question now, which is, everybody within that SEAL unit is given the ability to own the decision, right? So whatever the outcome is, whether it ends up being a good decision or a bad decision, you own it, right? And that's where this aspect of extreme ownership comes from. Even if it's not directly attributable to you, if you had a hand in it somewhere along the way, you take extreme ownership for it and you say, actually, this is mine. I will own it. And that breeds a very different type of culture. But in getting back to what you were asking at the core of this, in terms of how do you enable people, a critical component that underpins this aspect of are you able to make decisions outside of this aspect of fear and ego pertains to psychological safety. And psychological safety created by the leader or the leaders within the organization to let you know that it's safe enough for you to be able to make those decisions without a fear of discrimination, right? That's a critical aspect. If you know that, hey, I'm going to make a decision, if I get it wrong, I'm really going to be hammered for this, you'll naturally retreat into a position of relative safety and stay within those confines because it's not psychologically safe for you to do that. If you're given the freedom to do that, where you say, okay, you're able to do this, and if you feel that's okay, what are the learnings we can take away from this? So the next time you encounter something that has similar characteristics or DNA, that you're empowered then to make better decisions in terms of that. So that it's an ecosystem that works together in terms of that. Getting to the aspect of ego, and that's for me that involves a lot of self work, right? If we go back to the likes of Eckhart Tolle, who's written extensively about the ego, That's something that you work on a daily basis. To Paul's point, having the awareness around that, but it involves a high degree of self actualization and realization before you're able to recognize the different aspects of the being in terms of the being and the ego, and realizing that they're actually separate, although they're housed within the same vessel.
One of the things, Ted, if I can just add on what you're saying, one of the things that helped me in that is coming back to my first point around quantum thinking. And the reason why people can't identify ego in themselves is because they don't believe they have one. They don't believe there's a subconscious thing that's going to change and make they don't believe it. Seriously, and if you believe that, you won't see it. As soon as you release the fact that, okay, maybe I do have an ego, maybe my ego is influencing me, let me examine it. That's the self-actualization. And through that process of sort of quantum thinking, helped me tremendously to identify these dimensions. Because before that, most people won't admit they have an ego that influences their decisions. They go, this is all subconscious, philosophical stuff. But the ego is always there, and it's a bias. Like I was saying to a colleague of my mother, it's bias. There isn't a second in reality that we live in the universe that bias doesn't exist. There is always bias. You just don't know what it is. Just because you can't see it, you can't name it, doesn't mean it's not there. And that's the same conversation I have with the ego. Except for 1 minute, you have an ego and it does influence you. Just accept for 1 minute. Don't argue with yourself. Don't deny it. Accept it. Then you'll be able to see it. But if you don't, like he said, if you don't accept it at a self-actualization level, you'll never find it. And you won't control it. As simple as that. So it is a process, but and that's the important piece. You've got to open your mind up to think that everybody's right. There isn't a wrong answer. And when you step away from the universe like that, you see the answers. But unless you do that, you won't see it.
Great stuff, Paul. So there's a lot of great stuff that I've been writing down. I'm going to come back as to how we would implement change based on these points. But once again, a quick recap. You mentioned, Cree, that to combat the ego and fear impacting an employee's decision making, create a safe space. When an employee is unfairly penalized, they may not be willing to take steps and decisions on their own going forward, which actually impacts the company. And I think that's what we're saying. And you touched on a few other things there, Paul, that there is bias, there is an ego, which is great that in the modern organization we have all this training, right? And all these courses and things like that. And we can certainly see the need for all of this. But I'm going to come back as to how we address this in the end, because we've identified a whole bunch of things that organizations and leaders need to implement to become better organizations, and that's great. Let's move to a slightly different step now, something very important, right? So I did some research before this session, and I looked at what various think tanks have identified as some of the biggest obstacles facing leaders today in large organizations. And what's interesting is that we had different answers based on different parts of the world. In the US or North America, the number one issue identified as facing leaders, especially of large organizations and teams, was the various generation gaps that exist. And the difference in opinion, work styles, perhaps even ego and fear levels between young and old. Now, something else that I realized when doing this research is that when we think young, we think of the millennial, right? However, 2021, we're now at a time where Gen Z is entering the workforce, Gen Z being younger than the millennial. Some of the research that I read through showed that there's actually big differences between the millennial and Gen Z. Gen Z or Z, I'm not sure why I'm saying Z, very American. It just shows the influence, right? Watching too much American TV, but they're basically born with a cell phone in their hand from day one. They like social media. They prefer virtual worlds, so they're very comfortable with remote work, Zoom call, Teams, what we're doing right now. However, they might be more introverted and may not be team players, or to the extent that previous generations were. Now, I'm going to challenge the two of you. With what I've just put down, and if I said to you, this is an issue we're facing in our organization, how would you go about starting to address it? What are two or three things on top of your mind that you would raise as something that could bring the generation gap together? Let's start with Paul.
Right. So before we get there, what do we have? So it's fine asking for change, but let's get down to the nuts and bolts. Not everybody can change. Not everybody wants to change. Not all the organizations believe they should change. But let's get down to the nuts. If you want to change anything, and it's like changing cultures, like anything else that you want to change, it's a change program. You have to influence someone, put it that way. It doesn't matter how you need to influence or what you influence for you, it's influence. So for me, and we've had lots of discussion, I've done a lot of research on it. The most effective leaders have three very important traits. And I'll talk to this point shortly. Empathy. They're empathic. They understand, they can feel other people's pain there. They're empathetic. They're humble. Humility is a very, very important trait in this new world. Now, I'll get back to why you asked the question around this new generation, introverts, they're living behind a camera, because that plays a big role. And then trust. Must be trustworthy, must be able to give you trust. The three biggest traits for a very effective leader in not only dealing with generation types, but also uncertainty. So it applies equally to uncertainty. Okay. If you're going to lead an organization through change, and I was also in the military, and I was in the 44 Parachute Battalion, and we have a very strict regime. But the one thing, the two leadership skills, the two things I learned about my military career, two things I learned. Leaders, and I came out very young age, and this is how I thought the world worked. This is how I was, I played. And a leader in the band, doesn't matter if you're an officer, doesn't matter if you're a colonel, a major, captain, commandant, doesn't matter who you are, what you are. You're in the trenches, in the front line with your troops. You don't wear any rank, everybody's equal. When you're in a hole together, everybody's equal. There's no rank. Leaders in that space lead from the front. They lead from the front. What does lead from the front mean? It means that you will never ever do something, tell your team to do something that you will not or cannot do. That's the first rule. Because what does that do? It fundamentally teaches the leader what's the problems on the ground, not the theoretical hierarchical conversation and surveys and in the ground, in the chest. What is the real answer to the question? Not the filters to that. So that breeds leadership from the front. And those two characteristics I gave you around empathy, trust, and humility is tied very close to that. If you want to lead, you need to have those three principles, and you need to be in the front with the troops. You need to be in the hole with them. You need to be doing them with code. I mean, with Carlos, my colleague, he owns the sort of the whole pop flex structure at Nedbank. Me and him were coding not too many weeks ago. Coding. The executives, we're coding with the team. Code, hitting keyboards. You're in the hole with the troops, and they see that. They go, oh, okay, right. This guy's not in the back office. He's not sitting in a corner office. He's in here, midnight. We're coding with the team. That's what they see. Now, when we start doing that, we start building this almost impenetrable trust. In fact, I was accused not a few years ago of why is my team so militantly supportive? They fanatically support me. And I think that's the level of trust we built over a few years. You pick on one, you pick on all. So you need to be that. Now, when you're going to change millennials, okay, you also need to accept who they are. I mean, many years ago, somebody posed the question to me, and it wasn't millennials. And I was doing a leadership thing at Gibbs, Gordon Institute of Business, and we had a conversation. I mean, this question came up. Do you know what I did? I ended up jumping onto my mobile phone, joining a game. And I still remember this game. In fact, I've still got it on my game. I still play today. It's called Forge of Empires. And it was amazing. I was like, what is this whole thing about? What is all this about? And I stayed on it for a couple of weeks. And the one thing that hit me in the head, like and I came back to the class and said, I actually understand now. He said, what did you learn? I said, this is what I've learned. I learned a 16-year-old can run a guild like this club or guild or unit with 100 people in it, most of which are older than 20. and they come from 54 different countries in the world, all different languages. But there was a 16-year-old leader who led this guild to the number one guild or unit or construct on the server. 16 years old, 100 people, 50 countries, different languages, different time zones. That's leadership. He was 16. He wasn't even my boss. I'm like a 45-year-old. I'm playing a game with these 16-year-olds, and the 16-year-old was the CEO. Think about that for a moment. That is leadership. And unless you understand them, unless you're in the trenches with them, you won't understand. So, if you want to change the Gen Xers, you want to get those guys on your side. You're in the trenches with them, and they see you in the trenches. Then maybe you'll have half a chance. Because then it all becomes irrelevant. Really, this whole notion between Gen X and it's a great academic conversation. Because we like to put things in boxes. People like to put stuff in boxes. Take a box off the shelf and we want to talk about it. But actually, the reality is, it's not as bad as we think it is. The fact that we've given it a name and put it in a box. But it doesn't change the fact that if you want to join people, regardless of age, race, and color, or creed, you've got to do them from the front. You've got to show your leadership skills. So let's get back to basics. When people are these generations, you're confusing yourself. You want to lead people, get in the trenches with them, prove that they can trust you, prove you can trust them, understand their will. Then this conversation goes away. Then I can lead 60-year-olds, I can lead 16-year-olds, I can lead my 7-year-olds. You need to have a conversation. Basic principles: get in the troops, build your trust, be empathetic, listen and understanding, and have a trust. Then you can lead any group of people. Doesn't matter who they are, where they are, and you'll do it successfully. One of the reasons why I was successful in my latest project at Nedbank, also landed a project across the world, as you guys know, was be careful. Why? Different time zones, it ran smoothly. I can't remember of any big hiccups. And you've got to be there with the troops. And if you're in there, that's the secret sauce.
Yeah. So that really old school leadership principle still unites people. Is still the most important thing, or one of the most important things in today's fast-changing world. Okay, that's great. That's very interesting. Empathy, humility, trust. Lead from the front. That classic, the picture that we have of a general with his sword right in the front, the troops behind him, and you'll unite all of them behind you effectively. Right. I like that. Cree, how do you then? What would you add to that?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I did something for the organization a couple of months back on managing generational diversity. This aspect of diversity and inclusion in multiple paradigms is now very much top of mind for most organizations, and even in the world at large. And it was really interesting for me. There were 5 things that popped out, and if hopefully I remember all of them correctly, that span across all generations that are within the workforce. So there are these 5 common things that they look for. Paul's already touched on some of those aspects. Number 1, top of the list, is exactly that: lead by example, right? And you guys have done a fantastic job of articulating that, so I won't go into more detail. Some of the other aspects that people look for, irrespective of generation, is that you as the leader need to be accessible to them. So, when they have a challenge, when they have an issue, that you are available and you are accessible to them. So, be it in a physical format or even in a digital one, that you are in fact available and accessible. They're also looking for someone who's able to challenge and motivate them, right? And at the same time, as much as you're doing that, also hold them accountable to certain things. Accountability is a critical aspect in terms of that, because it's also a litmus test for them in terms of, am I really hitting the mark in terms of the things that have been set forward for me? And as human beings, right, we always want to be challenged to bigger and better things. We don't always want to be playing the game in the easy mode, right? You want to be progressing up in terms of the levels. They're also looking for a leader to be a coach and a mentor. Critical component, right? No one just wants to be in a space where they're just doing their work. They want someone at times to be able to step in, give them certain tools and guidance, and be able to coach and mentor them through their journey. And the final aspect is a critical one, right? whoever it may be, ourselves and the leaders included, we want to know that the work that we do makes a difference and that it really contributes to something bigger than ourselves. And what we're finding now in many organizations, the traditional model used to be, here's our vision and here's our mission. You're finding many orgs now speaking about purpose, and a purpose statement is now holding much more weight. And for the generations that that have come after ours, that for them is a very, very strong orientation point for them. This aspect of purpose and knowing that the things that they do make a difference. So those are the five things that I recall.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about that coaching mentor thing, Cree. I actually had that down as a question, and to you, Paul. I actually had that down as a question to ask you guys today. Obviously, leaders have to do coaching and mentorship, but should you volunteer it or should you wait for someone to ask you for coaching or mentorship? Is it arrogant for a leader when he sees something wrong to say, look, I think you need a bit of coaching? Where do you draw the line? Let's start with you, Paul.
Okay, I mean, first of all, it comes back to this word. To answer your question, one of the characteristics that I've mentioned of a good leader is humility. Okay. So why would I wait for someone to come and ask me to be coached rather than offer it? That's the problem. Out of ego.
Right.
That's why I don't offer it. I wait for somebody to come ask me because then I'm important. It's ego at play.
Right.
So if you have humility, you offer it all the time. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, been on some of my team calls. Every morning I offer help to everybody. And I don't think if you look at my team or even Pat, our CEO, and we meet twice a day with the entire leadership team. And every day I ask them, can I help you? What can I help you with? Humility is like charity. Okay. It's not charitable if somebody forces you to give someone money. It is charitable if you do it out of your own volition. And for me, that's around that's the difference. If you have to ask for it, then you've lost the meaning. You must give it willingly and freely anytime, and you shouldn't wait for people to ask you, because that's just blaming the ego.
But just to be clear, Paul, some people might have it the other way around. So you're saying it's not ego to offer it. It's actually ego if you sit back and do nothing. But what about people who feel you coming on strongly to them by saying, "Oh, I think you should."
But that's got nothing to do with the leadership skills. That's got to do with your communication skills.
Right.
If I come along and I'm too hard, or I talk loud and I talk in a certain tone. A lot of people, when I talk to people, a lot of people think I'm hostile and I'm angry. I'm like, I'm aggressive. I'm not. It's just my style. I'm like, I can't change it. I mean, my wife moans at me every day. Well, I sit in this little study and the door behind me leads into her thing, and she goes, slams the door. Everybody can hear what you're saying. I shout. I love that. So again, we mustn't get confused, and people like to use those things as sort of reasons. And again, you must be conscious of it. What's wrong with like Mahatma Gandhi offering to give him somebody his time versus me? Why am I like the dead guy? Why am I like the arrogant? But when Gandhi does it, it's like, oh no, it's Gandhi. Oh no, you being Willie, it's thank you. When I do it, everybody goes. There's no difference. Again, it's around the communication style. And I think the premise, the underlying basis for that, is if you offer something, it's coming from a charitable place. And if you hold on to something, knowing you can do it, but you don't, knowing you can help, but you don't, knowing that you can help, but don't offer, that's ego. Now, I'm not saying that's if you're aware of it. If you're not aware that you're doing it, maybe you can help, but you just didn't think about it. I mean, that's a different story. But I'm referring to these two polar opposites. Humility and ego, in the counteract ego. I mean, if you know you can help someone and you don't help you, what is it? That must be ego.
Yeah.
Or a fear. It can also be a fear for you making a fool of yourself, fear for you being reprimanded. There's many reasons why you wouldn't offer help, but generally it stems from fear or ego. But if you genuinely offer help, if you volunteer help, that's not asked for. Generally, it's coming from a place of charity, and for me, that's the swinger here. That's the swinger here. Generally, not saying always like that, but in most cases.
Cree, how do you approach mentorship and coaching?
So the coaching, and I must admit, over the years, the approach to coaching has changed. When I first became exposed to it, or was asked to coach someone, I always had this view that I had to have all of the answers, right? So this person's coming to you for coaching, or you're leaning in to help them. You got to have all the answers, and you need to be able to pull it out so that you can say to them, "Hey, this is the route in terms of getting from A to B." And that's absolutely not the case. There's forget the guy's name, but he owns a company called Box of Crayons, and he does a course called the Coaching Habit. Probably one of the best courses that I've ever done. And the entire aspect around coaching, modern day coaching, is around staying curious. So really helping the person that you're aiming to coach to get to the insights, the outcomes, and the actions themselves, right? So at times it may involve being a little bit directive. You can't take that approach in every scenario, but by far and large, often when people get asked, they say, "Hey, I'm struggling with this." One of the very quickly, probably in the third or fourth sentence, the person who's being asked feels compelled to provide some sort of an answer or a framework for an answer, right? In most scenarios. And there's a line that he shared. I think the guy's name is Michael Steiner, if I'm not mistaken. It's just come to me. And this stuck with me because he repeated it so many times in the course. But he said, "Can you stay curious a little bit longer? Can you move to insights and action giving a little bit more slowly as the coach?" So while you're in this dialogue, and there's a list of 7 questions that he empowers you with, so that you pose these questions to people, and through this process of running through these 7 questions, almost like a formula, invariably they get to the answer that they need to get to. So I've started incorporating that into my coaching, and the feedback that I've been receiving has been fundamentally different, for the positive, versus the way that I've been approaching it before.
Right. But I'm gonna ask you something difficult, and it has to do with being difficult, right? Life's not all rosy. There's going to be times where sometimes you need to criticize someone. You need to tell him, "Look, you're not doing a good job." I think people will find this useful. Paul, what's the best way to approach that? To really get to an acceptable outcome, but for whatever reason, you have to tell someone, "Look, I'm not happy," or "I'm not happy with the job you've done," or "You've done a bad job," or perhaps some other bad news that you have to give him or her. How do you do that?
Again, if you know me, I'm a straight shooter. So, best advice, if you have to give someone advice, good or bad, say it straight. Don't explain the point. A lot of people say they don't trust their leaders because they never tell them the truth, or they never tell them that they fluff everything up. We've gotten to this age where a lot of modern day leaders want to fluff everything up and make it sound. No, if it's wrong, it's wrong. You tell them it's wrong. I'm not happy, but at least I'm being honest and transparent with you. And over time, and a lot of my team will tell you, there's no fluff with me. I call them arrow and arrow, and a spade. Make no mistake. And some of them I use the full letter expletive. You can't use it. But the point is, they trust me and they respect me because I give them the straight answer. There's no fluff. Just give them the straight answer. And I'm not saying you should throw full letter expletives in it, but what I think the principle behind here is, if you have to give anyone any feedback, good or bad, give it to them straight. So why would I not want to give a guy, like bad news from a leadership perspective? Same way I gave him the good news. If I celebrated him, I put it straight. But on this hand, everybody loves it when I'm straight and I'm praising the guy. But on this hand, it was like, "Oh, I'm going to fluff it up." Yeah, call it straight. If you're going to do it this side, do it this side. And it's about being honest, truthful, and transparent. Don't fluff it up. Give it to him straight and narrow. And most people will respect you for that, even after the moaning it. I mean, I've had instances where people in my office a number of years ago, and we've just come out of this bonus and increase cycle. Yeah. On the one hand, I'm giving him one of the best increases and bonuses I gave everybody in my division. And I looked at him, "You're not going yet. Here's a written warning for your behavior the other day." In the same meeting, 2 minutes apart from each other. Respects me for that. He respects me for that. And that became quite a famous story. And by the way, he was a youngster graduate that I was coaching. And it's the way he treated leadership, because this was bad manners that he was showing. It was a leadership problem. And I said to him, pat you on the back, best bonus, best increase. I think you're doing a sterling job. However, I'm also going to give you a written warning now, because your behaviour yesterday was unacceptable. And they still respect him. He still phones me every day, and I still coach him, and he still relies on me. And Paul, I want to share my thoughts and my ideas. He still uses me a bit, but when I engage with my staff, it's always straight down the middle. There's no fluff. If there's a problem now, I'm going to tell you now. And it just happened with the time I told him was when I was giving him bonus increase. Why should that be different? Why should I have another meeting to give him that? Yeah, this sounds great. This hand, it is what it is, guys.
Do you still carry your gnome, Paul?
Huh?
You still carry your gnome?
I still carry my gnome. Yeah, in fact, I actually said to you, I'm going to 135 tomorrow. I want to bring my gnome back. I'll show you my next time.
We'll explain the gnome.
My consultant.
Yeah. I'll explain that in a future video. I'll have to think about how I'm going to explain it in a friendly manner. We'll talk about that.
Well, you're gonna have one of those big stars, like in the old scope. When I bring up the gnome, you have to put this big star on. It'll probably offend someone,
But I think Paul's point is basically be direct. Earn the trust of your people, and once you've earned that trust, it makes even the difficult conversations more straightforward. And that's what you want. You want to get to a result. Cree, any tips on the difficult parts of leadership from your side?
Yeah, so in terms of and leadership's difficult every single day, right? Choosing to lead, whether you've been given that title of leader or not, is an active choice, and it's often a very challenging and difficult and lonely path, right? But as long as your motivation is sound in terms of why you're doing it, you'll find a lot of fulfillment and inner peace in terms of that. Coming to the feedback piece, there's a model I can share with you. You're welcome to Bing it or Google it, whatever your search engine of choice is. But it's called OIR, and it stands for observing, impact, and reinforcing. And the model pretty much explains about how you can give feedback if in a format where it doesn't come across in an emotional manner. Not everybody's equipped with those skills, right? Paul's been doing this for a long time, and he's got his style, he's got his model, and he's super comfortable with it. And that's another important thing. Whatever you do has to resonate with you from a level of authenticity. Don't adopt it if it doesn't work for you. If it doesn't resonate with you, it's going to come across as very mechanical and engineered if you do. But getting back to the OIR model, so as an example, we were getting ready for this, right? And let's say Paul and I got into the call and Tavash wasn't on the call, like 20 minutes into it. We end our call, so let's fast forward 2 hours from now. And if I wanted to give you feedback, right, a few ways I could give it to you and say, hey, you know what, you really wasted our time. I had to put the baby to bed, etc., etc. I was making time available for you, and you cut into time. Another method, if I use the OIR model, is where you speak to what happened. So you say, Tavash, I observed, and the O stands for observed, that you were 15 minutes late for our designated time. The impact of this is, and that's where the I comes in, was that we were unable to start on time. It threw my schedule out a little bit in terms of being able to put the baby to bed in time. And the R speaks to reinforce, and that goes back to how do you think we could prevent something like this from happening in the future? So you push it back to the individual so that they can then say, well, how do they reinforce in terms of that? That model works fantastically as well in the converse. So where you're giving positive feedback. So I could say, if you were here and you were set up as you were on time, after this, I could say, hey, Tavash, I observed that prior to getting on this call, the meeting invite was set out. You had done a mic check with all of us, and the video quality was right. The impact of this was that I was very much at ease, and there wasn't any anxiety going into the call. And the reinforced pieces, I would encourage you to do this going forward. It really gave us a fantastic experience.
Yeah, very, very interesting. The OIR model, right? I really like that, Cree. That's great. Okay, so let's do a bit of a recap. I think we've had a great conversation and a lot of points, right? So we started with quantum leadership, and we talked about this new paradigm. And thanks, Paul, for really bringing it to our attention. Um, you should be able to look at opposing views. You should be searching for the question because there may be multiple answers that are correct at the same time. For example, the CFO wants to save money, but the IT manager wants to spend money. They're both right. Saving money is good, but you need to spend money to get something done. What is the question? Right? Really powerful. That really, really stuck with me. Right? And we can explore quantum leadership a bit further in future. We then talked about what may prevent you from being a good leader. And really, what struck out to me was ego and fear coming up repeatedly. And we spoke about how to potentially, uh, dissipate those two. We spoke about some very good traits to address some of the common problems like diverse group of people, generation gap, empathy, humility, and trust. Earn that trust. Paul spoke about leading from the front, which is the oldest trick in the book. No, it's not a trick, but the oldest
Nothing new. It's nothing new.
nothing new. Yeah, and it's still the best way. Lead from the front, get into the trenches, and you will earn that trust, and that solves so many problems. And then I really like this OIR model in terms of when you have to give difficult feedback, especially, but even for positive feedback. The OIR model, observe. What was the I, Cree?
The impact of the observation
Right,
of the action or inaction,
right. And the R being the
reinforce in the
urine.
model.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Now, even though we're almost at the end, I'm going to challenge you guys again. These are fantastic things that we've spoken about. Okay, great, great. How do we make it real? If I'm a new leader, I'm recently promoted, it's a fairly large team, and I like everything that you said, but I don't know where the hell to start. What would your advice be
Start
to
at the
me?
beginning. Start at the
Start at the
beginning.
beginning.
And people laugh at me when I say at the beginning. What's the first thing comes to your mind where you should start? Just one thing. Start there. And it doesn't matter if you remember quantum thinking in leadership. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about being accepting both. So start at the first thing that comes to your mind. That's a start. It's a start. Don't procrastinate. It's a start. Whatever pops into your mind first. Whatever if it's a gut feel. Don't argue against it. Don't try and evaluate it that it's probably a low probability that's going to work or it has a very low chance of even impacting. It's not about that. It's not about the answer being right or wrong. It's about taking action at the moment that you find it. That's the point. And I think that is the downfall for all modern leadership. You want to procrastinate. You want this. What it is. Guys, at the end of the day, and that also comes from, I know Cree mentioned the Navy SEALs. There's a very good piece on Navy SEALs where the guy was giving an example around them under fire. But there were 4 challenges. He had a teammate down. There was a guy coming on the roof. He had knocked down the store. And there was the ground. And he was leading the team. And there were like 4 priorities. There were like 4 things. Every one of the 4 things had a consequence. So how do you prioritize? He says you don't. You pick the first one and you do it. And everybody does the first one. You put maximum effort. You choose one. Doesn't matter which one. But you put maximum effort against it.
So it's part of all this.
And then you go to number 2. And then you go to 3. Then you go to 4.
Yeah. It's part of all this great theory, Paul. You're saying don't overcomplicate it. Don't overthink it. Take the theory, sure, but if something is logical, if there's a logical place to start, then go there. That's it, right?
Absolutely. And it's not about you being right or wrong. Who's going to say if you're right or wrong? Paul, you made the wrong decision. Well, no. I didn't know I made the wrong decision. Because unless you got a crystal ball or a time machine, it's an academic argument.
Yeah, there's an old saying, tell me where you buy your crystal ball from. I'm going to buy mine from there as well, right? Or something like that.
So it's not about right or wrong. It's not about right or wrong. It's ridiculous. They always say it's about right or wrong. It's not. And that's the point I was making earlier. Never base a strategic decision on statistical probabilities. That's exactly why I say that. Right. Exactly the point that I was making.
Right. Cree, where do you start?
So Absolutely. There's so much material out there, and if one adopts the view that, if you've been promoted into a leadership people manager type role, often people think, oh, I don't have the skills, I don't have the time behind me or the experience. I'm going to spend all of this time or a large portion of this time going and gathering information and trying to empower myself in that manner. Critically important, right? That learning journey is one that never ends, and if you believe that it's a set of courses and then you're magically going to get it, doesn't happen. To Paul's point, you've got to pick something and you've got to run with it, right? And you won't be able to incorporate everything that you've learned or you may have read all at once. You're going to have to pick a handful of those and really start with that. But for me, it's always been about one thing. Whenever, irrespective of whichever role it has been, um, a leader without willing followers, in my mind, is nothing more than a dictator, right? So you got to start with the people and start with the people first. Invest your time in your people. So for me, I've not had hundreds of people, so the teams have always been quite nuclear in terms of that ability to have the one-on-ones with them. So set that up. Let them understand who you are. So it has to be a session about you sharing in terms of yourself. First, they need to be able to see scars and all, right, and understand that you're also a fallible human being. They need to know what you stand for, so you need to start forming that relationship, and then delve into aspects with them. Understanding about themselves, their families, what are the things that are important to them. It ties back to that to the earlier piece that we spoke about, right, in terms of managing generational diversity. Those things are all portable back in terms of this. How do they attach in terms of purpose? What are the things that give them meaning? How do they want to be challenged? Those kind of things. You secure your people as the first block. The rest of it comes after that. Without them, you just don't accomplish anything.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Right. I want to thank both of you for giving us some of your time. It's almost 9:30 on a weeknight.
No,
So
I'm going for
Paul,
my whiskey now.
Yeah, thank you for accommodating me and the little baby.
no
I appreciate
worries there. Paul, closing thoughts, just to add to what Chris said.
Closing thoughts. I agree with what Chris saying, and again, my mind keeps gravitating towards this point. Is always remember there's no right or wrong, and it's just humility. And I'm listening to Chris again, and I keep this for some reason it drags me all back. And just be human, just be normal, be who you are, be authentic, and you can accomplish a lot with that. And that's a broad topic all on its own. But yeah, just be you, just be authentic. And that builds trust.
Yeah. And I think that's the perfect way to end this, right? Be authentic. That builds trust. Building trust and leading from the front is what actually takes care of a lot of the issues. And it's nothing new. It's a traditional leadership tenant, I would say, right? So even though quantum leadership is new and exciting, I guess what we're saying is there's some traditional values and lessons that still hold and still apply even in today's world. Okay, that was great, guys. I'm sure the viewers got some value from that. Paul, you just want to add to that?
I want to just say something. You mentioned a point like this quantum leadership is new. I beg to differ. You like to research that, and the audience go and research and find out when the first time the notion of quantum physics, the word was mentioned, and when it was coined, and you'll be surprised. It ain't new.
Yeah.
It ain't even in the 20th century, by the way.
Right.
And it's 200 years old. Even quantum is an old concept, very old. So I thought I'd just leave that and give the viewers and yourself a bit of a challenge. Just go and find out when it was. Go and find out how old quantum science is actually. It's not very new.
Yeah, I'm thinking Niels Bohr and those guys.
Long way back.
Before that,
long way back.
Right.
Oh, long. Newton was having debates around quantum physics.
And I think he was.
You could use that as a yardstick. Newton was having debates.
And I think he was 16th century, right? Yeah. So Isaac Newton, just to end, one of my favorite scientists of all time, right? We'll talk about that some other time, and we'll talk about your gnome. But anyway, I'd like to end it there. So, viewers, I hope you really enjoy that. Our guests have been kind enough to give us some of their personal time, as I said, later on a weekday. But I think there's a lot in the discussion, a lot of value, and I will summarize everything and put any links at the bottom of the video to anything interesting that can add to the content. That is it for us for tonight. Part 3, lessons in leadership, quantum leadership, and I guess making it real. I hope you enjoyed that, and we will see you again in the near future. Good day.